Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third session of Perennia's Take Your Product to Market webinar series. The series is funded through the Agri-Food Accelerator Program. My name is Clarissa McIsaac, and I am a member of the Quality and Food Safety team here at Perennia. For those of you who are not familiar with Perennia, we are a provincial development agency with the mission to help farmers, fishers, and food processors be more prosperous and profitable. We are Nova Scotia's only technical development agency focused solely on our food sector and maximizing its value. Our quality and food safety team work primarily in the Maritimes with agri-food and seafood companies, and we offer solutions to quality and food safety challenges. So in today's session, we are discussing the basics of Canadian food labeling under federal regulations. Our guest speaker today is Gnirss, the president of Legal Sweets. Gary has been involved with food labeling compliance for 30 years, and in cooperation with Food and Beverage Atlantic, he has been bringing food labeling training to Canada's East Coast for the past 15 years. He has also been writing the food regulatory column in the Food in Canada magazine since 1997. So for those of you who have joined us today, I just want to go over a couple of technical pieces for using Zoom. So this presentation will be followed by a short Q&A session. And as a guest, you won't have the option to ask a question using a microphone. So if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available for viewing on Perennia's YouTube channel. Okay, Gary, I will stop sharing my screen and then you can go ahead.
Okay, are we good, Clarissa?
Yes, I can see your screen. It's good.
Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's Gary Gnirss speaking now, and I'm pleased to be here to present at least a very quick overview on Canadian food labeling. Our principal focus will be food labeling under the authority of CFIA, which is a federal agency that governs that. Much of the food labeling that we are involved with is under federal rules. Not all of the food labeling, but much of it. So today's presentation, we're going to do a little bit of just introducing food labeling for those of you who may not have had the experience as of yet and are still learning the ropes, so to speak. We'll have also a very brief introduction into the legislation, because you will need to eventually understand what governs your food, and you'll need to get resource materials from the legislation in order to effectively work with food labeling. Then we're going to spend most of our time, which is very limited today, but we're going to maximize our content on just the basic food labeling, things like the common name, net content, domicile, ingredient list, etc. And at the end, we have perhaps 15 to 20 minutes where we can take your questions. So that's kind of the basic outline for our program today. As the slide says, it's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. As part of compliance, we always try to aim our understanding at the same as what the people who govern us, whether it's Health Canada, CFIA, or provincial jurisdictions. We may not necessarily agree with them all the time, but it's an important part of compliance to understand how the people that govern us think. When we look at food labeling as well, we have like a fairly big country, and we have a number of provinces and territories that have their own rules concerning food labeling and food compliance, food standards. The predominant mechanical features are mostly outlined in federal regulations, but we can't disregard provincial considerations when it comes to food labeling. Our focus today is predominantly on the federal side, because that's where a lot of the mechanical parts of labeling exists with respect to nutrition and ingredient and allergen labeling, etc. But keep in mind that you may have some provincial considerations to deal with as well. Now, the federal regulations apply to intra- and inter-provincial movement of foods. As some of you might know, the federal government has capacity to regulate foods from a trade and commerce side. When it is interprovincial, meaning they cross provincial borders, you may be subject to additional considerations for compliance, CFIA's licensing, for example. However, for food labeling in general, whether it's intraprovincial or interprovincial, you're still going to be subject to the federal food labeling rules, allergen labeling, ingredient labeling, etc. So the two principal federal agencies or government bodies that govern foods is Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And in particular, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, those are the frontline inspection people who come and knock on your door. They will inspect your facilities for a number of health and safety issues as well, but they're also engaged with food labeling. So they're tasked with making sure that your food labels will be compliant, and you may occasionally get an inspection report from them indicating that you may need to correct certain things. So a presentation like today will provide some awareness on Canadian food labeling, but we hope to see you out in some training, because there is really a lot of considerations when it comes to food labeling. There's a lot of technical demand when it comes to creating a food label that is compliant. It's not typically an easy thing, as you'll discover. It requires a lot of patience. If you're learning about Canadian food labeling, give yourself lots of patience. Also, recruit the information resources that you're going to be working with on a day-to-day basis. So the slide you see in front of you now, this is just an excerpt from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's food labeling for industry web pages. They do a fairly good job with providing the content for Canadian food labeling. And what I mean by that is that it has a lot of content. It really does. It's pretty good. The biggest challenge we often face is trying to find stuff on this website. But it is probably, if you're starting off with food labeling, the number one resource you should probably be looking at, because it's an immediate exposure to the basic principles of food labeling. It also gives you links to the applicable sections within the legislation that you can follow up. And that's the important part too, is that we don't just use this resource for labeling. This is just a starting point. It's not a comprehensive of everything you need to know, but it's certainly a good starting point. So if you're dealing with, for example, the common name for your food, there's a section on there. If you're importing foods, you're going to be interested in country of origin marking. Most people with packaged foods are concerned with the net quantity. Those that have more than one ingredient may be subject to ingredient labeling or allergen labeling. So they organize the various components in that regard. There's also another section that they outline that is more commodity specific. We do have some general food labeling rules, and you'll see some of the core things like the common name, net content, ingredient labeling, nutrition might be more universally applicable to all foods, but then we have certain commodity requirements for things like dairy products or maple products, fresh fruits and vegetables, processed fruits and vegetables, etc., meat products. So even though CFIA has kind of consolidated their activities, and the new legislation, the Safe Foods for Canadians Act and Regulations, has consolidated many of the federal food regulations, we still have differences when it comes to commodity. So there still are some very specific commodity differences. And I don't want to give anybody the impression that they're regulated any differently than any other food. What we are looking at is that certain products like honey may have additional considerations beyond just the core labeling that is applicable to most foods. So use these resources. It's very easy to find. I just Google CFIA food labeling for industry or CFIA's food labeling toolkit, and you'll hit this page and off you go. The other more advanced references that we sometimes provide, if you are getting to the point where you need to understand a little bit more, it's very difficult to avoid actually picking up the legislation. And on that note, the Justice Canada's website, the Justice Law's website, that is where the federal government keeps a repository of its regulations and its acts, like the Food and Drug Regulations and the Safe Foods for Canadians Regulations. And you will need to peek into those. So that's a great resource. You can PDF or get the PDF or the HTML version, whatever you want. The other one that is actually really good, and that is done by the Federation of Law Societies of Canada. This is, again, getting a little bit more advanced for some of our participants, but if you're really looking for resources, if you're talking about, let's say, a maple product, and you know that Quebec and Ontario have very strong maple products regulations, then the Canadian Legal Institute website, I call it CanLegal 2, is a great way to access that information because it includes both federal and provincial. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you can do some simple keyword searches and expand upon that. But give yourself some time, patience. Like there's a lot of information out there, and it's not always easy to get to, but it is out there. Okay, so there's a lot of self-service you can do, and the learning curve is quite steep for food labeling and compliance. But take advantage of all the resources that you can find. So, in respect of the legislation, as Mark Twain once said, get your facts first, then you can distort them as you please. Don't make up your own rules, because everything you see on a food label, there is going to be some requirement or some sort of interpretation that involves that. So in order to understand that, you need to be aware of what applicable legislation there is. And from a federal viewpoint, the big ones really are the Food and Drug Regulations, where it's not just from the point of view that you have requirements within that legislation that dictates that a food must have an ingredient list and how to declare that ingredient list or what the common name is, but there's also food standards. And the food standards will dictate perhaps what the common name of a food will be, in addition, of course, to the compositional requirements for that. Very similar, we also have the Safe Foods for Canadians Act and its regulations. And those are also important for very similar reasons, because they outline labeling requirements that may be similar to what's in the Food and Drug. There's a little bit of overlap sometimes, like for example, the Food and Drug may have a requirement to include the name and address of the principal place of business. So too does the Safe Foods for Canadians regulations. But the Safe Foods for Canadians regulations on its own covers the net content declaration for consumer prepackaged foods. The Food and Drug does not. So you really need to work with both sets of regulations if you're going to be understanding the compliance of food. So in our presentation, we try to identify the, what legislation is going to be applicable for the different elements that go on a food labeling. When we look at food labeling, and that's not to say that all food labeling, but predominantly food labeling applies to packaged foods, or what we refer to as the prepackaged food. It's a very important definition for us. If your food falls within the idea that it's prepackaged, it's ordinarily sold to or used or purchased by a person, which could include an institution, then you're going to have to put labeling on it in some capacity. There may be some exceptions, but there will also be requirements. And when we kind of cascade it down there, we differentiate between consumer prepackaged and non-consumer prepackaged. They are both required to be labeled, but there may be slight differences. So for example, non-consumer prepackaged foods may not need a nutrition facts table, whereas a consumer prepackaged food would, unless there's an applicable exception. So when it comes to consumer prepackaged foods, foods that are packaged at retail may have more exceptions to labeling than foods that are packaged before it gets to retail. But nonetheless, these are all prepackaged foods. On the non-consumer side, these would be non-consumer prepackaged foods. We have basically three kind of categories. Those that go to food service, like restaurants. Those that go to further manufacturing, that go to other facilities where the food is used as an ingredient, or perhaps they are bulk foods that are sent to retail. They all are still required to be labeled when they're considered prepackaged, but the manner in which we label them may be different. So for example, bulk foods will require a nutrition facts table, whereas the food service and the further manufacturing foods are required to provide nutrition information, but they don't necessarily need to print that on the label. So we try to filter out or cascade our requirements in terms of what the foods are. So this particular slide here just kind of reiterates some of the basic common features for consumer labeled foods, prepackaged foods, and the next slide will do the same with respect to non-consumer prepackaged foods. So there are differences, and you need to be aware of those. One of the bigger differences is that the weights and measures regulations is applicable to all foods basically in Canada, but predominantly that kicks into play when we're dealing with a non-consumer prepackaged food. It governs the way that the net content will be displayed on a non-consumer packaged food. The Safe Foods for Canadians regulations will also have a say, and in particular with certain commodities like meat and dairy and processed fruits and vegetables. As once said by Bertrand Russell, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people are so full of doubt. Now, if you have doubt about food labeling, we typically in compliance say that's a good thing, because if you have doubt, you will be seeking to answer questions, and questions is a quite normal part of compliance. It's a day-to-day thing. So a little bit of doubt is good. Panic is not good, but doubt can be quite good. Use it to your advantage. When we look at food labeling, we start to work with the terminology and the appreciation and the definitions, and you'll find there's a lot of acronyms that we use in food labeling. So for example, we have PDS, which is the principal display surface. We have the principal display panel. We have the available display surface. These are all important geographic markers, understanding what these are. So for example, the PDS would be the main panel that's exposed to a consumer. We get the area that can dictate some of the type heights. The principal display panel is, however, the panel, if you put a panel on a PDS, that is the panel that's put on the PDS. That's the PDP. And on that panel, we must have at least the net content and the common name. There may be other things as well, but that's going to be part of your panel. The ADS, available display surface, we now use to determine where and how the nutrition facts table is declared, as well as excuse me, the new ingredient labeling will have to be on an ADS as well. All right. So when we look at the basic core features for food labeling, it's really the basic 5, or we include 6 because we put allergens kind of with ingredients. So we differentiate them by what's required on that PDP, and that would be, for example, a common name, which most foods will require that. If you've got prepackaged foods like fruits and vegetables, they're just single ingredient and you can see them within the package, you may be exempt from a common name, but most foods will need a common name. Most foods will need a net content declaration of some sort. Some foods that are prepackaged that are not otherwise exempt, fresh fruits and vegetables as an example, would be exempt from nutrition labeling. There are other ones, but if not, you'll need nutrition facts or nutrition labeling. The domicile is the name and address of the principal place of business. That's also going to be required for all packaged foods. Ingredient lists may be required. Typically, if your food is prepackaged with more than one ingredient, you're going to need a list of ingredients unless there is an exception to that rule. And allergen labeling, which includes gluten and sulfite labeling, may be applicable if, of course, your food contains those allergens and glutens, right? And in the bottom left-hand corner, we see a little bit of references. You'll see that will identify some of the little markers we have in the presentation. The old guy with the cane is the former rules, and the new is the new. So we have right now a transition that we're working with the former regulations, the food and drug, and the new regulations with the food and drug, because there are differences in respect of how the nutrition information as well as ingredient list will be declared. The new rules currently right now, the end of the transition period, is December 14th of 2021. So up until that point, we are going to be working with the former and the new rules, and you'll need to manage that one. So on CFI's website, you can actually click on the former or the new rules, depending upon which one you're working with. If you're working with the former rules, you work with the former rules in their entirety. If you're working with the new rules, you work with the new rules in their entirety. All right. So when we look at a food package, we have to understand the geography of that package, and because that's going to define the areas that we have to place certain information. So we already know the common name and the net content. That's going to be on the PDP, the principal display panel. The ingredient list can be anywhere but the bottom. If it's the new version, it has to be on the ADS, anywhere but the bottom. And the same thing for the allergen information. The dealer name and address can be anywhere on your package but the bottom. Nutrition facts has to be on the ADS as we define that surface. So none of the information here needs to be grouped together. So nutrition information, dealer name and address, and the ingredient list and allergen information, they do not need to be grouped together. If you want to do so, that's fantastic, but it's not a requirement. Some information might need to be grouped together with the ingredient list, but that's dependent upon the different scenarios. So for example, if you're adding aspartame and sucralose, often you'll see additional statements next to the ingredient list that quantify the amount of those and identify that phenylalanine is present in aspartame. Okay, but for the core information, you don't have to group those together. So basically, when you look at a packaging, everything that you see on a package, excuse me, is going to be subject to some sort of regulation or consideration. So that means when we complete our food labeling, we look at everything in the full context. Okay, Jimmy Fallon says, thank you, horseradish, for being neither a radish nor a horse. What you are is a liar food. Now, to prevent us from being a liar food, we have to identify our food by a common name. And quite simply, there are three basic tiers. We use a standard name if it's prescribed in the regulations. If there is none, then we will use a common name that is generally known, like a cookie and ginger ale is a good example of that. If there is no common name, we will use something like seasoned lemon chicken with rice and a sweet and sour sauce, which is a very descriptive way of identifying the food, and certainly that will identify quite clearly what that food is. In respect of a standard name, we have to be, again, familiar with the legislation. This is the food and drug, or an example of the food and drug. In Division 4, we have chocolate products, and what we see here is that the S and square brackets in the regs means it's a standard, but important for us with a common name is that everything in boldface type in the regulations represents the common name. So if you meet the criteria, the compositional criteria, you can call this particular food or ingredient a chocolate, bittersweet chocolate, etc. Now, the Safe Foods for Canadians regulations have similar considerations that, for example, the Canadian Standards of Identity, which is part of the regulations, but it's incorporated by reference, so you can get a link to that from CFIA's website. And in respect of Volume 4, which is processed fruits and vegetables, if you're dealing with frozen French fried potatoes, anything that is in boldface type, except for italics, that will be a common name. So that you need the regs to understand what are the mandatory common names, so you'll have to browse through them to appreciate that. When we look at the placement of a common name, a principal display panel could be on more than one. In the case of this PopTarts, which everybody's familiar with, I hope, we have a vertical and a horizontal panel. We duplicate it, so the common name will be on both. When we look at the placement, it could be anywhere on that PDP, which is applied to the PDS. In this case, it is the term pastries and the French term tartelettes that's the common name. Typically, the minimum is 1/16 of an inch. Based on CFIA's food labeling modernization rules, we're going to see some enhancement to that. Right? So we have to know, principally, it's on the PDP, minimum of 1/16 of an inch. That's the basic considerations. You have the choice of regular or bold, but if you're not exempt from federal language requirements, you must be declared in both English and French. When the waitress asked me if I wanted a pizza cut into 4 or 8 slices, I said 4. I don't think I can eat 8. So that leads us into our discussions on the net content. Net content is maybe one of the little bit easier subjects to deal with, but there's still a lot of rules that govern that. Often the question comes up is, do I need metric on my label? And the answer is yes. If you put metric on all of your labeling, you're going to be satisfying all Canadian requirements. There are some foods where you don't need metric. So that would be for non-consumer prepackaged foods. Certain of those don't need so, but to keep life very simple, we typically will just use a metric net content declaration, and that's quite adequate, and it's the simplest and easiest. Same thing as per the common name, the net content will appear on the principal display panel. If it's more than one, you're going to have to repeat that on both panels. When we look at the net content, now the important part with this Pop-Tart to consider is that we do have inner units, and these inner units are shown here in the aluminum foil package. And those inner units, they do not have to be labeled if they're not sold individually. If they are going to the province of Quebec, then of course things have to be in French on the inner ones and so forth. You can't put anything on there that's not permitted, but you don't really need to label inner units that are not considered prepackaged, and those would be things that are not sold individually, used to or consumed as such. So in respect of the net content then, we have options. We typically can present the net content based on the totality of the different units. So here we have 8 units, which we don't have to say, but it's nice for consumers that we will say that. We call 8 pastries. So there's 4 pouches with 2 each, but the minimum requirement would be that we put the net content on there. The net content is displayed on the principal display panel. The type height is proportional to the area of the principal display surface, and in this case, most likely it's 1/8 of an inch, anywhere between 5 to 40 square inches of PDS area. So this is a metric declaration, 400 grams. We leave a space, lowercase g for our metric, and off we go. Okay, so there is still a lot of technical things in terms of spacing, type heights, and rounding that you'll need to get familiar with. The next slide here will just show examples of different type of declarations, and we try to keep things simple, so perhaps stick with the easiest one, just the metric. You don't need a prefix like net weight, pod net. If you wish to do so, not a problem. You can use other measures like U.S. measures, but be careful because U.S. fluid measures are not the same as Canadian. Why do we do that? Because some people want to, but if we want to keep things easy, just stick with the easy way of doing things. The net content, what you also have to keep in mind is that certain commodities, and in this case it is a link, this is from the units of measure for prepackaged foods, that includes both consumer and non-consumers. So what you see on the slide in front of you is that the manner of declaring the net content is prescribed for you. So honey, as an example, must be sold by weight. You don't have a choice. On the next slide, these are specific to consumer prepackaged foods, but not necessarily for non-consumer. So, for example, if you have peanut butter is sold by weight because that's just what the rules say. On the next slide, in Table 3, this is the measurements for prepackaged products other than consumer. So that means non-consumer packaged foods. If you have something, for example, like ice cream cake, which is a dairy product, then the unit that you're going to be using is volume because that's prescribed. So we need to get used to, there may be certain circumstances like dips where you may have, if it's very thick, the declaration by weight, or if it's more thinner, you can do by volume. So sometimes you have a little bit of a choice. But we have to get around the idea that for certain commodities, we don't have a choice. The other thing to become familiar with the net content is that certain foods are also subject to standard container sizes, and those are going to be in Schedule 3 of the Safe Foods for Canadians regulations. The slide in front of you here will just point out peanut butter, which is not subject to a federal standard, but when you see in column 2, these are the incremental size that peanut butter can be sold in Canada, which means you cannot sell a peanut butter in a 275 gram unit because the unit increment must be according to the rules. There are some ways you can apply for test markets and so on, but if you don't have that, you don't have any choice when there's standard containers that are applicable. The formatting of the net content is also very technical and precise. The way that you use uppercase and lowercase, the way that you round values, that is all going to be defined. So it's not just you put whatever you want up there, the type height, the bolding of the numerical portion. Those are all the technical features that you'll need to get accustomed to. And CFIA is very, very particular. If you forget that space between the numerical portion and the metric symbol, that will show up on your inspection report. So we are a little bit anxious with some of these technical requirements because we do not want to engage CFIA over some of these very trivial technical points. But CFIA is very willing to engage you with some of these, right? So this is just something we try to avoid. They're easy ones. It takes a bit of discipline, but it's something that is a good strategy. You don't want to get hung up over small little things on your label. So become familiar with the way that the net content is declared. It can be declared anywhere on the principal display panel on the upper part or the lower part, unlike the U.S. where they put it on the lower 30%. So become familiar with the proper presentation of the net content. The domicile, or what we refer to as the dealer name and address, is also a key feature on your label. And as Mark Twain put it, part of the success of life is to eat what you like and let the food fight it out on the inside. So the domicile statement in Canada, generally we refer to it as the principal place, the name and principal place of the business. Typically that would be the formal name of the company or the company that's registered as carrying out a business under, and the address. Now, the address portion right now under the current rules doesn't necessarily say you need a street address, like 123 ABC Street. At a minimum, what CFIA indicates is that you include the city, the province, or the state. They don't say that you need a postal code, but I would suggest that for contemporary purposes, put a postal code as well at a minimum. If you want to put more than that, you want to put a street address, by all means, that's not going to be a concern for you. With CFIA's food labeling and enhancement rules, in the future we may have to have additional information on there, perhaps a web address, a URL, or some other means of contacting the company. But for now, a simple statement, domicile 1/16 of an inch, anywhere on your label except the bottom, typically would suffice. So what we see here is a picture of the PopTarts, and we'll see that it is not on the principal display panel because it doesn't need to be. It's on the lower part of the label, which is fine. And in this case, the PopTarts are not made in Canada, but they use a Canadian name and address, so therefore either a country of origin or the term imported by, importe par in this particular instance needs to be with the domicile statement. Typically a prefix does not need to be included, but here it would because it's an imported product specifically with a Canadian domicile statement. The country of origin is also something you need to be concerned with. Certain foods can get by with statements like imported by, imported par without actually identifying the country of origin, but other commodities, if you're dealing with fresh fruits and vegetables or meat products, dairy products, you may actually have to specify the actual country of origin. So that's one of those commodity-specific things to watch out for. All right, ingredient labeling is probably one of the most complicated parts and the most challenging parts for everyone. As stated by Alfred E. Newman, we are living in a world today where lemonade is made with artificial flavors and furniture polish is made with real lemons. So true. Ingredient labeling, however, is not a marketing tool. It's very technical. What you must declare, what you are exempt from declaration, how you declare that with the nomenclature, what terms must be used, what terms may be used. It's very, very technical, and this is probably the area you really want to dedicate some attention to. If you make a mistake with ingredients, unlike nutrition, for example, it may have more significant consequences. If you make an omission with an allergen, that would be a significant impact on you, may result in product recall. So you don't really want to skimp over ingredient labeling. It's important to make sure that you not only have an accurate list, but it's not going to create a misrepresentation of your food. Okay, so there's lots of considerations for ingredients. We actually have a whole day that we can spend on just basic ingredients. We have a program that we teach. We have advanced ingredients. We have specialized courses on food additives. So what I'm trying to tell you is that it's nothing that you can really master in one day, but give yourself patience, work with your formulations, try to understand the basic considerations for ingredient labeling. So the components, we are required to declare the ingredients that go into our foods and their components. Components can be declared parenthetically, or you can break out the components and you can declare them as if they were ingredients. So if you have an ingredient list and your colleague has an ingredient list, you may end up actually having two different ingredient lists that you prepare. Both of them could be perfect because there are different iterations or variations that the regulations will accommodate. Certain ingredients may be presented at the end of the ingredient list, so there are provisions within the regulations to facilitate the presentation. Don't make up your own rules, but if you have spices and seasonings other than salt as an example, or food additives or flavors, you can put them right at the end. You don't have to worry about the order. You don't have to worry about less than 2% statement that you might be familiar with the U.S. But you can use these kind of tools to reorganize your list of ingredients to make it a little bit easier for consumers and make it usually an easier, less burdensome, less redundant ingredient list is probably the strategy most people will be going with. The ingredient list under the former rules, this is the old guy here, it's 1/16 of an inch anywhere on the package but the bottom, English and French, and off you go. So this is next slide you see here is a Poptart label. And the Pop-Tart label will show you the former rules where we have uppercase letters, which was fine, that was not defined. And we use this to contrast to where the new rules are going. This is still the former rules. So under the former rules, you had a little bit of discretion in terms of placement, uppercase, lowercase, the colors, etc. But when we look at the new rules that will be coming into effect by December 14th of 2021, unless Health Canada extends that date, the new rules are very specific, meaning that the letter case choices will be, you don't have a choice. The heading ingredients must be used with an uppercase I, the rest is lowercase. All the ingredients will be started off with the uppercase, lowercase. You'll need to use a Helvetica or a sans serif type font. Anything in parentheses must be in lowercase. Ingredients are separated by a bullet point or a comma. Allergen contain statement, if you use it, will be bullet point or a comma, uppercase, lowercase. So these are all going to be defined. The line spacing and the type height is very particular with the new rules. The new rules also require certain mandatory declarations. So if you have what's referred to as a sugar-based ingredient, you must take all your sugar-based ingredients that are first generation in your food, and you will declare them as sugars, and then parenthetically you will list them in their respective descending order of proportion. Now, if you have something like, let's say, chocolate chips and a chocolate chip cookie, the chocolate chips will contain sugar. As long as you declare chocolate chips as the ingredient and the sugars is declared parenthetically, you don't have to pull them out and do that. But if you're adding the various sugar-based ingredients directly to your food or declaring them in that way, then yes, you would have to declare them as sugars. The other new rule that we have is that we no longer can use the term color alone as a collective term. We must identify all the colors that we're adding to foods by their individual common name. So in this case, Allura Red obviously is a color, and that's the appropriate common name. So the common names that we use in the ingredient list, some of them are mandatory, like I said with sugars. Allura Red by its individual common name, but not by a collective name. The ingredient list must be on black on a white background or equivalent to 100% black with maybe a 5% shading in the background or tint in color, what they refer to. The new ingredient list must be separated from other information on the label by use of a border or lines above or below to either side, depending upon what you need to separate that. You can use some shading to separate too, but the idea is it has to be a very distinct place. The new ingredient list must be on an ADS, but never on the bottom. Okay, so the ADS would be under the definition would exclude on a multiple serve package an area of the package that is destroyed when opening. So you can't put an ingredient list based on the new rules on a perforation strip. It has to have a little bit of permanency. So it has to be on the ADS on a single continuous surface thereof based on the new rules. So this is the next couple of slides. We'll just kind of go through a little bit about that, just kind of what we talked about. What we have to get familiar with is that the new rules are far more technically demanding when it comes to presentation than the former rules, which were a little bit more flexible. And also, before we leave this slide, is an indication that when you have a nutrition facts table on your package, which we're going to talk about very shortly, the information, if you have, for example, an 8-point nutrient in your nutrition facts table, so you'd be using something like figure 3.1, if that's the case, you are not allowed to use the smaller type size and the smaller line spacing, which is called leading. You must then use the larger size here. So anytime you have an NFT, nutrition facts table, with that, you're going to be using the larger type. Okay, so here we have some other basic presentations for the non-consumer packaged foods. The new ingredient labeling rules also apply to that. The only difference is you don't need to have that white background, but a non-consumer packaged food is also subject to the new rules. Allergen labeling is not new. The way that we present it along with the ingredient list is new. And as George Carlin once said, I don't eat lobster, shrimp, or crawfish because I don't eat anything that looks like I should step on it. Sounds fair enough. Okay. So with the allergens, we'll just introduce them very quickly to you, what they are, but you need to be aware that if you have, for example, any protein sources in your food that are derived from tree nuts that we have listed here: peanut, sesame, wheat, milk, soybeans, crustacean, shellfish, fish, or mustard. You must identify them either in the list of ingredients or you must use a contain statement. So you can't really mess this one up. If you've got protein from these ones, they're going to have to be identified by their proper common name on the label. If you have a gluten source, and those would be from barley, oats, rye, triticale, wheat, so gluten protein that is derived from these, it's in your food, then you will need to identify them by their proper gluten name, which are all shown here, not just by the term gluten, either in the list of ingredients or, if not, in an allergen contain statement. If your food contains sulfites and the level of the sulfites is 10 parts per million or more, and these would be added sulfites, you must also identify the sulfites in the list of ingredients or the allergen contain statement. Simply for ingredient labeling and for sulfite labeling, I would suggest you stick with sulfites or sulfiting agents, whether you use the pH or the F word. There may be other options, but again, we're aiming at trying to keep things simple. So keep in mind, sulfite labeling may be required in your ingredient list, but sulfite labeling specifically when it's 10 parts per million or more is a specific requirement that you must pay attention to. You don't really want to make any errors when it comes to allergen, gluten, and sulfite labeling. A contain statement is not required if your ingredient list exposes the allergens, glutens, and sulfites by their proper name. If not, you will then need to use a contain statement, which immediately follows the list of ingredients. Precautionary allergen statements, such as may contain, these are not required, but they may be accommodated by Health Canada and CFI. They prefer may contain naming the allergen or gluten source, as opposed to some facility statement such as, produced in a facility that also processes eggs. That's not going to be necessarily objected to, but CFIA and Health Canada prefer standardization if it's warranted that you put something like may contain peanuts. All right, I do not practice what I preach when it comes to nutrition. Dr. Oz says that, but who knows what he does. So nutrition labeling is also something that is, it's not rocket science per se, but there's a lot of number crunching involved. You'll need to equip yourself with the various resources. So this is in case of the new regulations, you're going to be looking at the Directory of Nutrition Facts tables, the reference amounts, which will help you with serving sizes, and the daily values, which will help you with calculating the percent daily values. It's also very technical. It's very demanding. It's very precise. There's not a lot of romance or what we refer to as freelancing. It is what it is. Probably, I would say the best way to go about it, if you're not really familiar with determining ADS and you're not comfortable with this, don't feel too bad, because many of us don't actually create our own nutrition facts tables. What we do, we often hire graphic designers to do it, or we can order templates online. If you have any questions, it might be a good idea to speak with the team at Perennia as well, because they have the resources, technical expertise to help you with nutrition labeling. It is very technical, but it's a lot easier if you get your numbers and you can plug it into a computer and generate your NFT. But it is very technical. So the slide here you're going to be seeing is a transition from the former to the new, and the new one really doesn't take up much more space, but it has some enhanced features. A few of them I'm just going to highlight for you is that we have now a percentage daily value for added sugars. That's something that's brand new. So you calculate what that is based on 100 grams of your daily value. We also have quantitative declarations for our vitamins and minerals, which currently under the new rules is just potassium, calcium, and iron as the basics. If you're adding vitamins and minerals, your NFT might have to be modified accordingly, but this just represents the core basic information for an NFT. Not all foods, as I spoke about earlier, require an NFT, but those foods that are prepackaged, that are not otherwise exempt, will need to carry the NFT. This slide, we're not going to go through all these details, it's just to illustrate that all these requirements that you see here, these are expected to be observed. It's extraordinarily rigid, and that's why I say it's probably easier for most of us to get our numbers, whether it's a lab or by computer generation, and then use an outside service or graphic designers to make sure that the templates are created properly. To determine what your the size eligibility. You cannot just start off with the smallest NFT. We have this thing that's referred to as the 15% available display surface rule, which essentially means, you'll see this on the next slide, you have to start off with the biggest version first. So for example, if figures 3.1 does not fit within 15% of the ADS, then you can use figures 3.2. You're not allowed to use figures 3.3 unless figures 3.2 does not fit within that 15%, etc. So it's kind of the cascading system like that. You can't simply start by figure 3.4, which is nice and small, because you have to determine what your ADS is first, take 15% of that, and then see if those figures fit within there. So it's a bit of a process. In the classes that we teach, we actually physically sit down and we go through with a hands-on example. It's the only really way to appreciate the ADS rules. For our purpose today, it's good enough that you understand that you don't start off with 3.4 if other figure versions fit within that 15% ADS space. Small packages, you'll see sometimes those are less than 100 square centimeters of ADS. You'll see that they may have a nutrition or a toll-free telephone number or an address whereby consumers can get nutrition information. You're still required to provide it, but it doesn't have to be displayed on the label. Foods that are for further manufacturing are also required to provide nutrition information, but some of them may not necessarily need to provide it on the label. Like bulk foods we talked about earlier, that's required to be on the label, but in the case of those for further manufacture or those that are multiple serving, we have an opportunity to present the information based on 100 grams or 100 ml portion. You don't have to round to 4 decimal places, just an exaggeration. But basically on a piece of paper that is sent with the conveyance of the food, with the basic core information, that would be quite adequate for that food. If it is referred to as a multiple serving ready-to-serve foods, and that could be something like a pre-portioned cake that is just going to be served in a restaurant as an example, you can put an NFT on a piece of paper, or you can just write it in a Word document based on the stated serving size, rounded values, percent daily values, and that's what you're going to be providing. So foods that are prepackaged non-consumer, they still need a nutrition facts table or nutrition information depending upon the scenario. Now, the new ingredient labeling rules we already talked about, but this is going to lead us into some additional considerations. As a child, my family's menu consisted of 2 choices, take it or leave it. In addition, before we conclude, we only talked about some of the very basic food labeling requirements, but there is a whole lot more depending upon your food. If, for example, you're dealing with organic foods, we have organic regulations. Commodity-specific labeling, if you're into various sectors like the meat, the dairy, fresh fruits and vegetables, then you're going to have to be aware of that. If you're dealing with mixed nuts, for example, there's specific rules for mixed nuts. So in addition to the core information, you'll need to be aware specifically of what all the rules may be applicable to your specific commodity. If your product is refrigerated, low acid, you'll need perhaps a storage statement that's applicable, keep frozen, keep refrigerated. If you have a durable life that is less than 90 days, you'll need a best before date, and so on. Okay, so there's a lot more to food labeling. We hope to see you maybe come out to some of our training. You can always check our calendar for up-and-coming training. We typically try to get out at least once a year out in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that again this year. So with that, I hope the information that we shared here was adequate for you, and I'll turn this back over to Clarissa.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. So now we're going to open it up for questions. We do have one right now, if you're ready, Gary.
Sure.
Okay, so he says, example, strawberries in wooden boxes. Up to present, we have limited our labeling to the flats that hold the boxes. Are there additional labeling requirements on actual boxes when new rules go into effect?
Okay, I'm not quite sure what these are prepackaged strawberries that go into a wooden flat? Is that what the question is aiming at?
Yes, I think it's strawberries in wooden boxes, and then those wooden boxes are in a larger flat.
Okay, so what we really need to do, if the packaging is considered to be prepackaged, then that's the unit you're going to have to focus on. So the display or the carrier that might contain those would not necessarily be a prepackaged unit. Okay, that might just be for transporting. But if the unit of sale, if we can look at that as being the prepackaged product, that is going to be the product or the packaging that will be required to be labeled. Now, if it's just strawberries, a single ingredient food, and if it's just fresh strawberries, it will not need a nutrition facts table. So that's the good thing. It will not need a list of ingredients, so that should make things a little bit easier. But as a fresh strawberry, as a fresh fruit and vegetable, there will be certainly net content declarations requirement. The domicile will need to be there. If they're not visible through the packaging, the common name will need to be there. And then, of course, if there's any grading for strawberries, I can't remember if there is or not, but with fresh fruits and vegetables, you have to always think about, is there an applicable provincial or federal grade that might be applicable, and that will have to be on there as well. So if it's just fresh strawberries, the new rules when it comes to nutrition and ingredient is not going to be a big impact because it's not required. You can declare them voluntarily, absolutely, but when you declare them voluntarily, you must follow the formatting that is required for any other food. Hopefully we got that question right. If not, they can certainly email that to us, whether myself or at Perennia, and we can maybe provide a little more context to that, okay?
That's good. Okay, the next question is, do frozen berries have to have nutrition facts tables?
Yes, it's the exemption from nutrition information applies to fresh fruits and vegetables that really don't have any ingredients added to them. It does not apply to frozen. So there are exceptions for foods, but I don't think any that will apply to frozen because, we're looking at, does it have zero nutrients, and that's not going to be the case. So I would suspect that in the absence of any exceptions, they're going to have to put nutrition information on there.
Okay. The next one is, are labeling requirements the same when selling online and in farmers market versus selling in retail space?
Yes, essentially the rules are, there's no really differentiation. What we look at is the unit is considered to be, if it's a prepackaged food, as an example, it doesn't make a difference whether you sell it in a traditional brick and mortar retail environment or whether you sell it online. It's still, the definition is going to be the same, therefore the labeling is going to be the same. Now, selling it in a farmer's market, there is some exceptions to that. Like, we don't have in Canada, unfortunately, very clear rules or very accommodating rules for very small businesses. But in the case of a farmer's market, for example, you still need to, if you have a prepackaged food, you'll still need to label it accordingly, but you may be amenable to a number of exceptions. Like, for example, if you are the producer of the food and and you yourself are selling it at a farmer's market, then you are excused from nutrition labeling as long as you don't make any claims, nutrient content or health claims for the food. So a farmer's market is kind of like in an area where CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agencies, might see it as more of a small business, and as long as you sell the food you make and don't make any claims, you still need to label it, but you will not need to have nutrition information, right? But they're essentially treated pretty much the same way, and then what we do is we pick apart what exemptions might be applicable depending upon that scenario. Selling it online is not a farmer's market, so if you are not otherwise exempt from nutrition labeling, you will need to have nutrition labeling on those foods.
Okay. So the next one is, how much information, if any, is required on outside of pallet if the packages inside contain all the information?
Okay, so when we look at the considerations for labeling, and again, you'll see this term come up quite a lot, the term prepackaged. It depends on what the prepackaged unit is. So, and it also depends on the food. Like, do we have more than one ingredient? Do we not have more than one ingredient? Because that's going to influence the nature of the labeling. If we start our conversation maybe on what we consider the prepackaged unit, if it's, for example, if the pallet contains prepackaged foods, that are going to be sold to consumers. Then we've got a consumer prepackaged food that requires basically all the needed information. Again, if it's a fresh fruit or vegetable, it will not need nutrition. If it's a single ingredient food, it won't need a list of ingredients. But the individual unit that is going to be sold to a consumer, that's going to be required to have all the labeling requirements in the appropriate manner. If it's graded, it'll need grade marks. Now, when we now use what we refer to, we put those units into a case or a tray that is used for transportation, then essentially, and it depends on the commodity as well, because meat commodities, when it comes to these kind of prepackaged transport scenarios, may require additional information than other foods. So Pop-Tarts is going to be in a different class. Fresh fruits and vegetables is going to be in a different class. But essentially, the outer unit, if that is not the consumer prepackaged unit, if the inner units had to declare nutrition facts or a list of ingredients, you would not need to put them on the outside. Your basic information, basically on a transport, would be: is there any storage conditions that are applicable that need to be on there? Is there like a domicile, for example? CFI would, would recommend you do that. The net content and the identity of the food, but you don't necessarily have to repeat all of that information on the outside of the transport case. There is a section, by the way, for anybody who's kind of, it's kind of hard because we're dealing with commodity sectors as well. They might have some different considerations. On CFIA's website, they do have on their food labeling for industry a section that deals with the labeling of prepackaged foods, the labeling of consumer prepackaged foods, and what's referred to as these transport scenarios. Okay?
Okay, so the next one is, could you please repeat the information required on the wooden quart of strawberries that are transported in flats? To date, only the information needs to be required on the flat. So I think...
Yes, if it's just the wooden that is used for the transport, that wouldn't really constitute the, and I'm thinking the flat, you're going to have an open carrier kind of scenario where the inner units are there. The inner units, of course, will also have an origin marking if they're strawberries, whether it's a domestic product or an imported product. But the wooden carrier that is just going to be reused, if it's an open carrier that does not really conceal that, is not going to need to be labeled.
So I just had a question about sulfite labeling. So if you have a product that has more than 10 ppm and you have it listed in the ingredients, do you have to have a contained statement?
A contained statement is never required if your list of ingredients includes all of the allergens, the gluten sources, and the sulfites. So if, for example, in that scenario, you have just the sulfites would be the concern, but you have identified the sulfites by a proper sulfite name. Let's say you use the word sulfites, whether it's a PH or the F version. That would be adequate for ingredient labeling. It would also be adequate for sulfite labeling. And if that's the case, you would not need to put an additional contained statement. Okay? So in other words, you can address sulfite labeling strictly within the list of ingredients by using the common sulfite name. But if you don't, then you have to put it into the contained statement. The other question that sometimes comes up is that, let's say I do put a contained statement and I don't have, for example, barley declared in my ingredient list because it might not be required to if it's part of a wheat flour, etc. But then I need a contained statement, and so what I would do is put a contained statement that says barley. But then once I put a contained statement, I must repeat everything, okay? Which means that even though I may have declared sulfites in the list of ingredients, the minute I have a contained statement, I have to repeat the sulfites in the contained statement as well. Okay.
Right. And if sulfites is a second generation ingredient, do you still have to declare it?
If the sulfiting agent, sounds like a question from somebody maybe a little bit more knowledgeable, because we're talking about generations. When we deal with ingredient labeling, we have to declare what we refer to as ingredients, which is the first generation. We also have to declare components, which is the second generation. Sulfites is a little tricky in the sense that you have to appreciate that allergen, gluten, and sulfite labeling differs from ingredient labeling. But they exist kind of in the same label space. So we can accommodate allergen, gluten, and sulfite labeling via ingredient labeling, but there are two distinct requirements. So from the ingredient labeling perspective, our obligation is we must declare first and second generation ingredients unless there's an exception or an exemption from that. So for example, let's say your ingredient is dried apricots, and the dried apricots contain a sulfiting agent, then we have to declare the first generation and second generation. So we do have to declare the sulfites for ingredient labeling purposes because there's no exception to the rule. There are some exceptions. You'll see when you get into the more advanced part in BO1009 of the Food and Drug, it gives you a table of the ingredients are exempt from the declaration of components, but apricots are not exempt. So the sulfites, regardless of the level, the ppm level, will need to be declared in the list of ingredients. If it's less than 10 parts per million, they're still declared in the list of ingredients, but they don't have to be in a contained statement, okay? So remember, we're looking at ingredient labeling and sulfite labeling. If you have any ingredient, whether it's exempt or not, that is 10 parts per million more sulfites in the finished food, then that falls clearly under sulfite labeling. That's probably one of the harder things to understand with Canadian labeling, because in the U.S., in comparison, you have sulfite labeling rules that really only concern themselves when there is 10 parts per million or more. But in Canada, we have to differentiate between ingredient and sulfite labeling, all right?
Right. Okay, so the only other question we have is, may we have a copy of this informative presentation? And yes, we will send that out to participants.
Yes, not a problem. That presentation has some links in there. The resources are pretty easy to find, but to make it a little bit easier for the participants, there are some handy links in there as well.
Okay, great. So I think that's all the questions we have. So thank you everyone for attending and submitting your questions. If you do have further questions, you can send them to Gary or myself, and we'll follow up with you as soon as possible. And we hope to see you again in future sessions of the Take Your Product to Market webinar series. The next session is on March 6th at 12 p.m., where we will hear part 1 of Packaging for Your Brand, Developing Your On-Shelf Salesperson with Daryl Monroe from Balance Creative. Okay, so that's all we have. Thank you very much, Gary, and for everyone coming out. And I hope you have a great day.
All right. Thank you, Clarissa.